Hundreds, who is a brother of R. Kelly. And it's our way of wanting to let you know that there's a tribute and celebration of the lives of Deacon Willie Cooper and Erica Tar Davis tomorrow at St. Philip Neri Church. It's also the weekend of the World Climate March, and this is one way to mark it locally as we try to start turning stuff around on our planet. I want to thank Lynn Norman Weiss for supplying that music and always the great talent that she's able to supply us. This morning we're going to have a discussion about what seems to be a increasingly hot local topic in Rogers Park. If you look at the cold hard facts, crime is down in Rogers Park, certainly down from 10 years ago when many neighbors wondered if Morris Avenue or Jarvis would ever be vibrant again, and certainly far better than 20 years ago when yours truly and some of our guests originally came into the neighborhood. But this summer in Rogers Park has had more than its usual share of headline shootings, mostly from street organization leadership battles, but some involving innocents caught in the crossfire. And is Rogers Park more dangerous today? What are police and community leaders trying to do about it? Are a few isolated incidents being fanned into a crisis by social media? And how does next year's automatic election figure into all this? I want to welcome Kevin O'Neill, who used to be a beat rep in one of the so-called hot spots in Rogers Park, who is going to talk about his perspective as a neighbor to see how things have changed or not. We also have Angalia Bianca, who's with CeaseFire Cure Violence, has been an interrupter working on the front lines not only in Rogers Park but many other communities around Chicago and now in Evanston. Thanks a lot for joining us this morning, Bianca. And Stephen Franklin, a colleague of mine from the Community Media Workshop, who in his work with ethnic media in Chicago has been involved with a campaign to try to shift the way the media covers urban violence and street shootings, primarily by promoting anti-violence solutions, particularly how we can promote more positive activities for youth. Thank you all for joining us. Kevin, are things hotter today in Rogers Park than they ever have been, or are we getting heated up by personal bloggers and folks with another political agenda, perhaps?
Right. Well, certainly, things are hot in Rogers Park. Are they hotter than they ever have been? I don't think so. I think, Tom, you and I both moved to the neighborhood around 1990, and frankly, I remember, seeing a murder victim across the street from my house when my wife was 8 months pregnant, and after having moved in, less than a year, so it's kind of scary. And so 1993, when they started the CAPS program in the 24th District in Rogers Park, I was the first beat facilitator in that area around Morris Avenue. And things were very, very hot then. There were a lot of bad buildings, wide open air drug dealing. And I'm not saying that there's not drug dealing on corners in Rogers Park now, but it's nowhere near as bad as it was then. There were many shootings. There were homicides. It's funny, we were using some of the same tactics then as using now. Beat facilitator John Warner now is using what's called positive loitering. We called it Operation Beat Feet back in the 90s, just getting people out on the streets. And I think it's a good way for people to feel good, to feel like, hey, this is my neighborhood. But not to put that kind of tactic down. It's not going to solve the crime problem in Rogers Park.
Kevin, just briefly, what is the role of a beat facilitator in the CAPS program? Tell people what CAPS is and what the beat facilitator does.
So CAPS stands for Chicago's Alternative Policing Strategy. The beat facilitator is more or less the go-between between the community and the police. They help facilitate monthly meetings with the police. I had not been involved since 2011 when they really cut the resources for community policing. I didn't find it as effective. I think there is a new commander, Rousseau, in 24th District, who's trying to put more resources toward it. They actually are separating out the beat meetings. It used to be one big meeting for 3 large areas. So anyway, that's the basis of CAPS. I think it's a meeting with the police at least once a month to talk about the hot crime areas and to get information to the public.
Angalia Bianca, what's your view about what's been happening this summer and fall in the community?
As far as I'm a resident of Rogers Park, and I've lived there, since 2011. And yeah, so I agree with what he said as far as, yeah, it's bad, you know, but it's nowhere. I mean, I think that it gets blown up a lot because of social media, but I believe what's happening right now, why these couple pockets in Rogers Park are really, like, you know, sparking up, is social media. So these young kids are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and then the worst are their rap videos on YouTube, and that's sparking, and they're not even, I mean, you know, if they have talent or they don't have talent, I don't know about that. But I do know that they are writing songs to agitate and call other gangs out, or specific people. And after this goes bad, and then the next group B, they do a rap video, and then when, you know, God forbid someone is killed, then the rival gang is on Facebook and Instagram and taunting. So these Facebook taunts and bullying is really a major problem. Do I think that Rogers Park is not safe? Absolutely not. I don't think so. Citizens do often ask me, because they know I work for CeaseFire Cure Violence, they'll say, hey Bianca, should I be scared? I gotta walk home at 5 at night. And I tell them absolutely not. You know, I mean, just kind of be aware of your surroundings. And yeah, some innocent people have caught stray bullets, and you know, it's sad. But I think that it's just a couple pockets. It's not the whole community.
Steve Franklin, you made a face when I talked about crime stats being down earlier during my intro. We've been getting a lot of headlines out of Rogers Park recently, but what's your citywide perspective on how shootings, alleged gang warfare, etc., are being covered by the media, but in the public perception of it?
Well, we have a problem with dealing with the numbers, and as the police superintendent will say, you know, this is a media problem. We're not a city afflicted by crime. It is true we have about 415 murders last year in Chicago. We were running about 900 10 years ago. So he said, well, murders are down. We're not the most violent city. We range between 13th and 19th in terms of homicide rates in the United States. Is that correct? I don't think it is. And I think here's the problem. The problem is that 414 murders in Chicago are unacceptable. In New York City, 10 years ago, they had 2,000 murders. Last year, they had 335. Our homicide rate in Chicago is 4 times that of New York and 3 times that of Los Angeles. If New York and Los Angeles reduce their homicide rates, we should do the same thing. That's the first issue. And the second issue is we're not a dangerous city altogether. As Angelica said, a very good point. There are large parts of Chicago where we don't have high crime rates. Overall, our crime rate in the city is unusually high. The city's overall crime rate is about 15 per 100,000, homicide rate. But there are neighborhoods on the west side and on the south side where the homicide rate equals that of Panama and El Salvador. That's unacceptable. And there's one other thing also, is you should never measure homicide as the total measure of violence. Right. Shootings. Why? Well, a lot of people don't die today because hospitals are very good. Trauma facilities get people there much faster. And so when you look at the situation, you have to look at shootings. Last year we had 414 murders, but for every murder, there were 4 other non-fatal shooting incidents. And that number this year is Citywide is running about 5% over last year.
You're listening to Live from the Heartland on WLUW 88.7 FM. I'm Tom Clark, and my co-host Michael James is just back from a whirlwind tour of South Africa. We're talking this morning about public safety and neighborhood crime, and perhaps a little bit about what we can do about it. In your work at CeaseFire, what do you try to do to intervene in when there is a hot spot that you've identified? So
if you want to talk about specifically Rogers Park, we have CeaseFire Rogers Park and CeaseFire Uptown. The staff there are intervening now, because of these recent shootings and the recent murder, and they're intervening with both sides, A and B, or who they think may have the beef with each other, to be able to mediate the conflict successfully. And I just want to add that collectively in Chicago, so far this year, in 2014, CeaseFire has mediated over 450 conflicts successfully, peacefully, that otherwise would have turned to gun violence, injury, and possibly death. So that's a big number, you know, and so we often hear about all the violence and shootings and homicides, but nobody talks about, you know, that there's many good organizations. It's, you know, not only CeaseFire. And so to combat the problem, we need everyone to step up. It's everybody's problem, and as CeaseFire's model goes, that violence is a learned behavior and it is contagious. So that's why we use a public health approach to combat it. But as far as, you know, with CeaseFire, we use credible messengers, which are rehabilitated men and women that were once in the life, that have relationships and street cred, right? And so, and these kids are going to listen to them, and myself included, and because we're not there. So, like, I want to just touch on this. We are not. So we don't work with the Chicago police, but we're not Chicago police bashers, right? So we each have our own role in stopping the problem. And the role of CeaseFire is to make these high-risk individuals understand there's a better choice before they cross the line into becoming the problem of the Chicago police. And at that point, there's nothing more we can do. But we would still, you know, I mean, I go visit guys in county jail, in prisons, right, whatever, you know, because as I know, I got second chances, and many of our staff also have, so you got to brush off and try to do the best.
And yeah, there was a film that has gotten a lot of notoriety called The Interrupters that Cart Templin produced, and I wondered, has that had any way of finding its way to people in neighborhoods to see that movie? And I know it's got a lot of attention from a broader viewing audience, but I just wondered if those among the masses get to see it, and what's the general impact of that film has had on the overall process?
So that's a good question, because a film like that is powerful, but if only the people who have no clue about what's going on see it, then really what has it done, right? So that's a great question, because we also go into prisons and speak to men. The prison IDOC has been letting CeaseFire go in to do a presentation just with us and talk to the guys. And I have sent them several DVDs of The Interrupters, and so like a week before we're going to go in, they show the movie to all those high risk. And so we've been working mostly with Stateville Correctional Center, and on October 16th we're actually going to be going, and this is the first time ever that IDOC has ever allowed this, and it took a lot of negotiation, but they've agreed. And we are going to be going behind the wall to talk with the lifers and the long-timers. And I'm bringing with me, among the group, are maybe 7 or 8 men who once did 30, 40 years in Stateville, who now work for CeaseFire or the Violence Prevention Program at the City of Evanston, who are credible messengers, where they know a lot of those guys, and they were cleared. And these are guys who once ran the city of Chicago in the gang life.
Gang world.
Then in the gang world, these men were in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s, calling the shots, running the prisons, and now have transformed into law-abiding citizens. And now we go back, and their names alone are so well known. It's like for I don't want to say names, but let's just say we had Larry Hoover, right? And then he changed his life, and now he comes back and says, hey, that's not the route to go, put the guns down. You know, that's really powerful.
Let me just interrupt and say, I think you raise a very good issue, and that, you know, crime is a deep, broad problem. And what we need here in Chicago and Cook County is a discussion. And actually, this is an issue raised recently. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars in some form of violence. Where is it going? What is it doing? Cook County only spends $1.9 million in some aspect of studying or looking at what violence programs work. We really don't know what works, and sometimes we make bad decisions. Right after July 4th, the police superintendent made a very pressing point. He said, we failed this weekend. And they failed because they flooded the streets. And that didn't work. So we have to look at what, you know, that, if I'm correct, the city spends about $100 million in police overtime, just on the theory that we don't need more police, we need to flood certain areas. Do we need more police on the street? Do we need more sentencing? Do we need more effective gun laws? Or do we need to start training and working and mentoring in the schools? It's a broad problem. And if we react to it symptomatically, then resolve it. If we react to it impulsively, we won't resolve it. And I think that's our issue. For example, take the question of CeaseFire. The police dropped the contract with CeaseFire. It had a 1-year contract. If I'm correct, on July 4th, in the areas, although CeaseFire gets state funds, they don't get city funds, in the areas where there was violence on July 4th, there was less violence in the CeaseFire areas.
So during that 1-year contract from the city of Chicago, it was for Lawndale area and Woodlawn. And within a couple months, the homicide and shooting rate dropped almost 98% in Woodlawn. And I'm not sure, you know, it's unfortunate that they didn't, you know, renew it. That's not my job. I don't know that part of it. But I do know that those 2 sites, when they were up that year, had huge reductions in violence. And we are funded by the state of Illinois. We have 16 sites in Chicago throughout the city. And we received $4.7 million from the state of Illinois. So those 2 sites that were funded by Chicago were not on the contract from the state of Illinois, but we've kind of tried to, you know, compensate to try to at least get a couple of violence interrupters out there. We have 1 violence interrupter in Woodlawn trying to still kind of keep at bay the relationships that they had formed already from the prior year.
That was Angalia Bianca, who was with CeaseFire Cure Violence. She was responding to Steve Franklin, who's with the Community Media Workshop. And I actually want to put a question to Kevin O'Neill, our former beat rep person. One automatic candidate responding to an alleged firebombing on Lunt this past week called for protective custody of known gang leaders as a way to preserve public safety in the community. Is that a way to have community intervention, Kevin?
I just have, is that the same guy who talked about Iraq, that compared our neighborhood to Iraq? Okay, I'm just throwing that in there.
And is it alleged?
It wasn't the alderman.
I think, let's just say this, I think there are a lot better, many other better tactics that we could probably use to affect violence. And one of the tactics that we used successfully in the 90s was going after buildings, the bad building owners, through housing court and through the criminal courts. Just because those are the folks who are housing, you know, some of the gang members, and the drug dealing is going on inside there, those buildings. So that, I believe, is a key, still a key tactic that can and should be used against these folks. Make sure that the leases contain writers that say, hey, if you do any kind of illegal activity in your apartment, you're going to be, you know, evicted. Those kinds of tactics, I think, are a better way to affect crime. And we used to work with CeaseFire in Rogers Park in the 90s, and we had a great relationship with them. Bring them back. I can't say enough good things. You still have some work there. Okay.
No, we have a full site in Rogers Park and
Great.
a partial site in Uptown. In Uptown, we currently have 2 violence interrupters,
Right.
and in Rogers Park, we have a staff of a program manager, supervisor, 3 outreach workers, and I think they're going to be adding a violence interrupter as well.
That's good to hear. I guess what I meant was we worked more.
Yeah.
We, in my you know, quote unquote job with the police, we definitely work closer with
Right.
CeaseFire, and
Yeah.
obviously not so much.
Yeah.
I would like to point out that we did invite the current beat chair facilitators on the program today, but downtown wouldn't let them appear. I'm not sure what that says about the city's community policing
It's
program.
really
but-
unfortunate. I mean, that's all I had to say about that. I
But
mean,
you did mention one tactic, this positive loitering. There's
Right.
actually a positive loitering event coming up this week on Wednesday, the September 24th at 7 p.m. at Pratt and Ashland. And before I forget, there's also a north of Howard safety walk taking place on Monday the 29th, a week and a half from now. Meet at the Willie White Park Fieldhouse. Why positive loitering? What is it, and why is that a tactic which people have been trying out?
well, I think basically it sends a sign to quote unquote bad guys that we own this neighborhood. We're going to walk together. We're going to be together. I think it's a great tactic. I've used it myself. The only bad part is I wish some of the walks would reflect the neighborhood. Frankly, I'm a white person, and it's almost all white people walking. and it just kind of looks bad. I wish
Yeah.
we could get some Hispanic people and some, African American people involved in that. I'm not saying there's no. Frankly, I haven't seen that many people of color on these walks. So I think we could do a much better job in recruiting, reaching out to the neighborhoods. Obviously, in Rogers Park, it's pretty much, 30, 30, 30, blacks, whites, Hispanics, and we just need to do a better job in reaching out to those.
In the South Side, there's a program called Brothers on the Block, and they have the goal is that they've identified about 500 streets that are dangerous in Chicago, and every Friday night they try and put a man on the street, and then they have scissors on the block. And on Saturday afternoons, they're on the street corners again on the South Side. They do double Dutch games, and they're there handing things out. And so it's a response. Today in Chatham, there's a slow stroll of people on bicycles, bicycling through the city. So there are groups. There's a group called Rage, which works in Englewood, and they have positive loitering. They walk up and down the streets. They have parties. So these things do take place.
Right.
But let me just answer the question. The city actually is doing something somewhat like targeting gang folks, and what they do is they've only gone to 190 people so far, and the police for the gang unit identifies the most dangerous people in Chicago, and this raises a serious question because they've come up with about several hundred. If there are only several hundred, then why do we get so much crime? And what they do is they send a police officer, some folks in the community, someone from ATF, and they knock on the door and they say, you've been identified as either being possibly killed or a killer. Here's your card, and this is your lottery ticket for life. Talk to us, we'll help you. And so far, it's a model program here in Chicago. This is copying it. So far, it seems to work. But for me, it raises a question. If the police say most crime takes place, and you can answer this, Angelica, among people who know each other, then we're not that dangerous a city. If you